we can get started.
All right, we're good to go when you're ready, Chair.
Okay, well, it is Wednesday, April 13th, 7 a.m. and I'll call this Station Policy Board meeting to order. And let's start with some introductions. You got Mark?
Okay. City of Olympia.
Good morning, everybody. Danny Woodrow with the Olympia City Council.
And Chair Lacey.
Andy Ryder, Mayor of Lacey.
Tumwater.
David, City of Tumwater.
And Rainier.
City of Rainier, Ron Kemp.
And the great city of Tenino.
From the great city of Tenino, John Joseph O'Callahan, fine upstanding American Irishman.
And Yelm.
Brian Hess here, City Council of Yelm.
Inner City Transit.
Don Melnick, Authority Member. Good morning, all.
Good morning.
And I just saw WashDOT come in as I look down.
Yep, Gaius Sonoy from WashDOT.
All right. And North Thurston Public Schools.
Deanna Maddox, Director of Transportation, North Thurston Public Schools.
And our emeritus representative.
Hi, this is Pete Kamat.
And our community representative.
This is Kevin Festinger, Community Representative.
Is there any, I'm scanning, I think I have everyone that's here, anyone that I have not called. Okay, and Chair Vina can go through staff if you would like.
Yes, please.
Okay, so from Tumwater, we have Mary Heather Ames. From Inner City Transit, we have Rob LaFontaine, Jessica Gould, and Eric Phillips. And then also joining us for the Smart Corridors presentation is a consultant for IT, Mark Yand with Parametrics. From Olympia, we have Sophie Stimson. From the county, we have Matt Unzelman. Did I miss anyone? Oh, and then TRPC staff. You've met Mark Daly, and I'm Deputy Director Vina Tabbitt. We have Karen Parkhurst, Dorinda Merrill, Berlina Lucas, Dave Reed, Paul Brewster, and I think that's it.
Oh, we had the county just showed up. Caroline.
Good morning. Hi.
Hey, great. Good to see you. And then let's go to the Executive Director's report.
Okay, so one of the things that we want to talk about is actually about the visit that we had earlier this week. But we'll do that during the state legislative session agenda item. So really the only thing that I want to make sure policy board is aware of is this week we resubmitted our application for a federal DOT RAISE grant for the freight mobility study that's been an unfunded study in our Unified Planning Work Program for a number of years now. We found out, we did a debriefing with DOT about a month ago, and they let us know that our previous application was scored as highly recommended for funding, which is as good as you can do, which means that it was on a short list of 100 some that actually went to the secretary. And it just didn't get funding because there wasn't enough funding to fund all the highly recommended. And so this year, when we last submitted, the minimum was 500,000. This year, many of the minimums are going up with the infrastructure package that having been passed. And so the minimum this time around was 1 million. So we've added scope to that and resubmitted. And keeping our fingers crossed that because we really need to get that freight mobility strategy funded and done. So wish us luck.
Great.
Thanks, Chair.
Go ahead.
I have a question to ask.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yes, you said the minimum is 1 million. In other words, we are now asking instead of $500,000, we're asking for $1 million.
That is correct. Yes, as many of the minimums for existing programs are going up with the bipartisan infrastructure law in place, a lot more money to go out the door. And so one of the ways that they're doing that is asking people to think bigger on their projects. And so they doubled the minimum on this particular
Okay,
opportunity.
so we actually are able to justify going from $500,000 to $1 million in 1 year for a study.
Correct. And if you want any more detail on that, we certainly can provide it. Mina Tabbitt's on the line. She was our chief architect in resubmitting. So Mina, could you talk a little bit about what was added to the scope?
Yes, we added a lot of consultant work to do planning level cost estimates and more design. So we were able to, once we identify projects in the plan, take them to the next level so they'd be then ready to submit for additional funding. So we just, it's adjacent to planning, but it's almost to the design stuff.
Getting into project development rather kind of past the planning phase.
And we've been talking to our members, and that's the sort of support that you all need to then have projects ready to submit to construction projects. So it's very timely that we were able to add that component to the grant.
Well, that's nice.
Okay,
Yeah. So Ryan, so normally that would be broken down into like 3 different phases. And so what we're doing here is we're actually basically doing almost 2 phases in one.
Okay, as I say, I'm just sitting here scratching my head going, we couldn't get $500,000. And so a year later, they're saying, hey, if you're asking for 500, we're not going to give it to you. You got to ask for $1 million. And I'm trying to wrap my head around the whole thing of, so we actually have this much money to throw around. And I'm just trying to figure out how do you justify that? Because it doesn't make sense when, as was stated prior to the meeting starting, inflation, we've got lots of spending going on. We've got a lot of bills that need to be paid, but yet the federal government is saying, hey, we're glad you're able to do a $500,000 project in 2022, but for 2023, it's got to be $1 million or you don't get it.
Well, that's what's interesting about this new federal legislation. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about the bill, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation later in this meeting, where it's really a completely different ballgame when it comes to our transportation funding. And I think everyone's sort of having a hard time wrapping their head around the dollars that are out there available for transportation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this meeting as well.
Okay, I appreciate that because as I say, I'm looking at transportation projects within Thurston County, within Yelm, that have been put off for how long? Because we don't have the money, and they're still going to be put off. But hey, we can add $500,000 to do a study, and that is so inappropriate when we already have studies that have been going in place for years. So I apologize for interrupting, but I'm just. As I said, I'm trying to wrap my head around $500,000 extra, or we don't get anything.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that more in the meeting. Is there anything else, Mark? Then can I get a motion to approve today's agenda?
So moved.
Motion in a second. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Then that motion carries. We have an agenda. Next up is the approval of our consent calendar, which is our meeting minutes, meeting notes, and our business and community representative terms and bylaws. Can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? And that motion unanimously carries as well. And then we're into public comment. And Vina, can you bring the people in for public comment? I don't totally have their list in front of me.
Yes, Chair. I'm going to allow them to talk. And the first person we have signed up is Anna Navarro. So Anna, if you can take yourself off mute, there you go. And go ahead.
Hi, I'm Anna Navarro. Thank you for the opportunity to make a suggestion to the board. I'm attending as a new Washington resident. I moved to Olympia from rural Mexico last year. And before that, I lived in the sprawling LA suburbs. I'll be brief, just 2 minutes. I suggest the board consider a Ciclovia program, an occasional car-free Sunday. I attended several in Los Angeles. They've had 38 since they started it in 2010. And LA County set up a 5 or 6 mile route closed to cars so residents could walk or run, be in wheelchairs, push a stroller, bike ride, and be in the streets. They were filled with roller skaters too. Tables were set up at a few of the intersections for route information, first aid, bike repair, and county departments had booths to advertise programs of interest to the public. But most of the event was focused on exercise, free movement in the streets, not set up as a race or a destination or a festival. What I enjoyed was that you could join the route at any point along the way. There wasn't a crowd at the start or end points. I saw parts of downtown LA that I'd only driven past in my car, and I visited shops along the route that I would never have gone inside otherwise. And I felt safe to be among a diverse group of residents who were enjoying a day outside. Then I had a chance one Sunday in Morelia, Michoacan, Mexico, near the Monarch Butterfly Reserve to experience their weekly closure of less than 2 miles of downtown streets, and it was a real treat. Spokane has one planned for Tuesday, June 21st, the summer solstice. And I just wonder if a Sunday open street pilot could happen in downtown Olympia. Then a future route could run between Olympia and Lacey, or Olympia and Tumwater, or a separate route in Yelm. Anyway, Berlina has the handout that I believe she's shared with all of you. And if you want to know more, I can tell you in the future about my personal experience walking Ciclovia in Los Angeles and Mexico. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful recommendation. Appreciate it. And I think next up is Karen Mesmer.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Karen Mesmer, a member of the Thurston Climate Action Team Electric Vehicle Group. We're working to promote the adoption of electric vehicles in our region, and we think that a great way for people to learn about electric vehicles is to talk with people who own and drive them. I'm here to invite you to the Drive Electric Earth Day Electric Vehicle Show on April 30th. It'll be from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. at Olympia High School on the North Street side. At this event, you can talk with local people who own electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles and learn about their cars. You'll also be able to see and tour 21 different vehicles. The Olympia School District electric school bus will also be there. This is a non-commercial and free event. It is sponsored by the Thurston Climate Action Team and the Olympia High School Climate Action Club. These are students. And that is all in cooperation with the National Drive Electric Earth Day. I hope you will take a chance to stop by and look at the wide variety of vehicles that are currently available for people, and talk with people who have already made the decision to own a vehicle and are happy to answer questions and show you their car. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate that. So I think that's it for our public comment. So next up on our agenda is the proposed business and community representative selection process. Karen.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I'm excited to tell you that we have over 20 applicants for our business and community representatives. And in fact, I got another one yesterday. We're sort of keeping this open until we fill the position. So I'd really like to thank everyone here who helped get the message out about applying for these positions. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about the process. So basically we have all the applications. We're looking at staff at TRPC. The proposal is that staff at TRPC will do the first cut. We will then pass them over to our officers. So that would be Mayor Ryder and Council Member Madrone and our business representative, Renee Radcliffe Sinclair. We would do a second cut and then create a list of folks that would be interviewed. The proposal would be for the officers of the policy board to be the interview panel. Staff would be there just to facilitate getting people in and out the door electronically or in person. And we would then be there to be present at the interviews, but step out as the team is making recommendations. So that's what we're looking at today. First review by staff, and then going to our officers, and then arranging interviews, and having our officers comprise the interview committee. And so that's what we're bringing you today for your approval, is that process.
Move approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Let's have some discussion. So obviously the difference this time around compared to the past time around, in years past, and I know it's been a little while since we've done this, is that in years past that the chair would select the interview committee. This time around, as we're talking this through, we now have 3 of us in leadership, so it made sense just to have the leadership team do the interview process. And so we talked that through, and it sounded like makes sense. And so now we're coming before the board for approval. Any other discussion? I mean, the other thing that we could always talk about is if someone really wanted to be on the interview process, we can have that conversation as well. And I have no problem with that either. Brian, do you have your hand up?
Yes, just during the interview process, that is going to be a stage prior to the rest of us meeting everybody and choosing the members. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, so normally how it go is, so usually how this will go is that staff will look at all of the different applications and see if sometimes can be a conflict of interest or whatever, and or it just not be something that it looks like it's a really, really good fit. And so they would do this sort of the first look at everything, and then they'd pass it over to us and say, here are the candidates. We would look through that as well and say, okay, who do we want to interview? We would go through the interview process, then come up with recommendations, and then we'd come before this panel, to the policy board and say, hey, these are our recommendations, and then the full policy board would vote on those recommendations. That's how the process works.
Right, and I understand that. I just was wondering, what are the criteria that I can understand looking for the conflict of interest, but what are the other criteria? And the reason why I'm asking is that it seems that, and please, it's early in the morning, terms aren't going to come out correctly. You may be packing towards what you want as your agenda or something like that, instead of looking for people who can enough diversity that can bring in other views and opportunities to learn from each other and provide a well-rounded board. And
sure.
I hope, as I said, don't mean to insult anybody.
Sure. No. I tell you what, that is always the goal of any interview process that I've ever been in, is to make sure we have a very well representation of the community. Now, I wish this would be, we have so many people and it's going to be really hard. The truth of the matter is we've had difficulty finding people to be our business representative and our community representative. At this point, we're just begging people who have interest to sign up, and hopefully we have couple interviews. But it is always our goal to have a well-rounded, policy board with different points of view, so on and so forth. You have any other questions, Brian?
No, I was just trying to lower my hand.
Sure. Peter, you're up. next. I see your hand up.
Thank you very much. So I was going to piggyback off what Brian just said. You have 20 candidates, and Brian asked about the criteria. You didn't say it. Essentially, you said you're trying to be more inclusive, but not really substantive criteria. Can you please?
Sure. Karen,
what the criteria are?
Karen, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Basically, this is the applications. I can make sure you all have a copy of the application so you can see it. We're really looking at level of interest. And so the criteria, we are very careful to say, what boards have you served on in the community before? But that's not a prerequisite. We really want people who have diverse experiences with transportation in the community. And so the criteria is, are you willing? Can you make 7 o'clock meetings? Are you willing to make a commitment to the depth of information that we often deal with on this committee, and sometimes the need for subcommittees or the need to do a bit of reading in advance? And so it isn't like you must be this, or this, have this experience. It really is, do you have a level of interest? We're looking for diversity in many ways. So we have folks who have applied perhaps that maybe rely on transit for their getting around the community. We may have folks who represent a business in the South County versus a business in Lacey or some other place. And so it really is about, are you willing to dig in and do the work? And what the questions we ask are, what can the board get from you? It's asked a little nicer than that, but what do you bring to the board? And then what do you hope to take away from this experience? And so the criteria is that you are a resident of the Thurston region. And for business representatives, again, as Andy mentioned, there are some conflict of interest because you make recommendations for distributing federal funding. And so there's certain kinds of businesses that might be at an advantage or a disadvantage because of that. We're also looking, I think it's important to mention geographic diversity. We obviously welcome folks from all over the community, and we have that diversity in our applicant pool. So it really is, are you willing to do the work? Are you interested in transportation?
And again, I'll request if anyone on this policy board knows someone on the business side or the community side, please make a recommendation. I'll say if we get 20 applications, I think I'll expand the interview panel from 3 to I'll ask a couple more people, but I think that might be wishful thinking at this point. Vice Chair, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm curious Karen, you mentioned making the applications available to the policy board. I think that's a good idea so people can see who has applied. And then also if somebody has a recommendation on somebody they would like to have interviewed, I would welcome that. And when we talked about this before, maybe there's somebody from the policy board who'd like to join the interview panel. So it's not just those chair, vice chair, and second vice chair. If somebody else is interested, that's why we wanted to bring this conversation to y'all, is to see if somebody else wanted to be more deeply involved. So I just wanted to put that out there.
And so I really think it's, if we receive a bunch of applications, I'm really more than happy to sort of take a look at it and say, hey, we have quite a few people here. Let's go back to the policy board and see if we can get maybe a couple more people to be on the interview process. If it's, unfortunately, we get a couple business reps here, it's a very, very small pool, then I think I feel pretty good about our leadership team, selecting the right candidate. So
we currently have about 16 applicants for the community representative. Wow. We have 4 for the business representative and 1 that said that they would be willing to do either. So we have a pretty good group this time. And I'm not talking about, we have a good sized group. I'm not making a judgment call about if they're good or bad, just that we have a good sized panel this time.
So then let's put it out there. Does anyone else want to join the interview team?
Been there, did that.
Anyone else?
If you need more people, Andy, I'll be glad to volunteer. Just let me know.
Okay, well, let's see if we can, let's start going through that process and then we'll, Kevin, you have your hand up?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Ryder. Quick question. What is the status with my term? I think the terms were changed from 2 years to 3 years, and is my term ended or where does that stand?
Basically, your term has ended, and at the end of a second term, according to the bylaws, the folks can, if they want to stay, they basically reapply. And so you are in the panel as a community representative continuing forward, as is Renee Radcliffe Sinclair as a business representative moving forward. So you're part of the panel of candidates.
So I just wanted to reiterate my earlier comment that while I've enjoyed serving on this and would be willing to continue to serve on this, if there's any opportunity for improving the diversity, especially by adding the people of color to this board, I would gladly step down.
Thank you, Kevin. We appreciate that, and we'll take all that into consideration. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, well, let's take a quick look at this, and then Don will be in touch.
Thanks, Andy.
Do we need a motion to approve this, or is
Yes.
this?
I did that and Don seconded.
Okay, great. Thank you for that reminder. Is there any other discussion? And all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed? And that motion unanimously carries.
Thank you.
Everyone. Now we're on to the Smart Corridors presentation, which I've been eager to hear.
All right, good morning again. Bear with me as I bring up my screen. And we have been eager to bring this to you. So I am Vina Tabbitt, and the majority of this presentation will be given by Eric Phillips with Intercity Transit and Mark Yan with Parametrics. And we're here to talk to you about something called Smart Corridors and Transit Signal Priority. And we'll go into that a little bit more in detail. As many of you know, there's a lot of special language that goes with transportation, but we'll try to demystify some of that as we go through this. So just as a little bit of background, what we mean by smart corridors, back in around 2006, 2007, we received some money from the federal government called congestion mitigation relief money. And it was to reduce a particular contaminant, particulate matter 10 in our area. And they convened and they said, what sort of projects would do the best benefit for that? And they came up with things that improved efficiency through our most congested areas. And I will say this funding and these projects are limited to the Lacey Olympia Tumwater urbanized area, just by nature of the air quality issues that will be faced there. So the goal of the Smart Corridors project is to make technology investments to take our regional urban corridors or strategy corridors and make them smarter, to make them more responsive to technology, to talk to each other, and use specific things called ITS or Intelligent Transportation System components. And to date, we've invested over 5.1 million in federal dollars and 800,000 in local funds, mainly in updating hardware in this region in terms of traffic signals. And I know that seems like a lot of money. Traffic signals turn out to be quite a heavy investment from what I've learned. And so in the attachment on the staff report, you can see the awards that we have made to our partners to date. And some of them are ongoing, many of them have been completed. All right, with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Eric and Mark, and they'll talk about what's going on now.
Thanks, Vina. Good morning. I'm Eric Phillips. I'm the development director at Intercity Transit. So I'm gonna, I won't spend a ton of time on the project background. Some of you have more history than I do on the project, but I do kind of want to go through a kind of an update of how we've put the project together, as far as managing the project and kind of what that structure is, because it does dovetail into how we use the local partnerships through the TRPC's processes of bringing folks together. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then towards the end of the presentation, when we get into kind of an update on the scope of where we're at with the project, I will have Mark come online and have him give a summary of where we're at, the scope of work. So I did want to start out just by reminding everybody here that we actually have two separate projects happening. So we have smart corridors, but we also have a transit signal priority, and they're different, but they're related. So both are projects that we're moving forward with this current phase. But as Mina mentioned, smart corridors is kind of the broader application we've been looking at in the region. And then Intercity Transit has been working specifically on the transit signal priority implementation, which is one of the operating strategies that we're working on first. So this smart corridor implementation phase is really focusing on that transit signal priority implementation. So just wanted to clarify that. Next slide. And again, feel free to stop me. I can't see all the hands, so if the chair wants to interrupt me, if I miss something, feel free to do that. A little bit more on kind of the background of Intercity Transit's involvement. We combined 3 separate federal fund awards into a single scope of work for what we're moving forward on. So that includes our original 2012 transit signal priority funds, as well as the more recent 2018 and 2020 smart corridor funds. So those were awarded over a couple of consecutive years, and those are combined from our project management purposes. So we have about 1.4 million in federal funds in the project right now. And of that, about 655 was the federal award for smart corridors. The rest was for TSP. Next slide. So as far as the budget for smart corridors, most of the funds that were awarded in 2018 and 2020, the total grant was being matched solely by Intercity Transit. So we're providing the local match. The corridor expenditures are really planned to be divvied up between the support work that TRPC is under contract to do with us. So we have an interlocal agreement with TRPC for planning support, and we structured this to provide the coordination through that same format that we're all used to working with the technical work group, the transportation policy board for updates, that type of thing. And then we've got about half of the money for design scoped out right now in the first phase with Iteris, and we have a chunk that's reserved for what we call the roadmap, which Mark will talk about a little bit later, and about half of that towards the implementation. So just kind of a quick snapshot. And this project is all currently managed within the Federal Transit Administration grant management side of things. So we've got that all set up as a single project at this point, just for reference. Next slide. So I do want to talk about the importance of this being a regional project, particularly with smart corridors, and the importance of the jurisdictional partnerships. And that includes the significance of the work that had happened previously that Mina talked about. And that this includes the approval of the more formal interlocal agreements that we have with each of the jurisdictions, and the support that we need to move the project forward with implementation to get to that vision of the smart corridor project that we've been talking about. So partnering for the project really builds on the past work that we've done. It also creates a forum for that better understanding with the agency partner concerns. So there's a lot of details when we get out in the field that need to be worked through, and we have a good structure in place to look at that. The project really looks to balance the competing needs, and it moves the discussion forward, relying on data versus speculation. I think this is really important because emotional decisions are harder to get through, but data-driven decisions is really the goal of this next phase. And I do want to note that between, so we had an older TSP award, but between 2016 and 2021, we really needed to go through that process to get those individual interlocal agreements in place with each of the partner agencies. And so that was important to move forward with both smart corridors and our original transit signal priority project. So those agreements address the really specific details of how we work within the jurisdictions, working with their staff, payments, safety, federal requirements, equipment tracking, field procedures, all that type of stuff is addressed in that agreement. So next slide. So a little bit about how we've set up the project structure. So Smart Corridors is, as I've noted, a regional implementation project. Intercity Transit's the project lead. We are also the grant recipient and we provide the matching funds for the Smart Corridor implementation. TRPC is we're using the interlocal that we have with TRPC to provide some of the technical support. So they're almost like a consultant, but they're really our planning support group through the regional process. And so there's some funding that's used to support that work. And then through that process, we've set up a technical work group. So the technical work group includes all the jurisdictional partners, includes the staff that are out in the field. So there's more of the signal shop staff, for example. And then again, Intercity Transit has interlocal agreements with each of the partner agencies to support the work. And we're responsible for the hiring and managing of the traffic engineering consultant work and coordinating the work plan. And so within the technical work group, which is this core team that we set up of the technical support folks and the jurisdictional partners, that's coordinated through TRPC, Intercity Transit, and our consultant team. And it does consist of your staff from each of the agencies, and it includes WashDOT and the work group. We've left it fairly open, so this is a work group that can be expanded for specific parts of the project, or broadened. So we envision it's likely later we may bring in emergency service folks to talk about emergency preemption as part of the project. But their role is really to work through the technical issues related to the project, be a liaison for their organization, help with the data collection process, which is quite a challenge, and then provide input to the project team. So that's a little bit about the structure. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of transition into the consultant selection and our technical resources for the project. Last summer, we went out with a request for qualifications for the consultant selection process, and we scoped the project to provide a broad range of engineering support services for both the Smart Corridors implementation project as well as transit signal priority implementation. So the plan was to work those two grant-funded projects side by side, taking advantage of the common work elements for efficiencies. And the consultant selection process had direct support from TRPC, Lacey, Tumwater, and Olympia when we went through that. So we had those staff directly involved with reviewing those different submittals and kind of going through the analysis with us to make that final selection. And through that process, we had a consensus agreement to bring on board the ITERIS team. And Intercity Transit Authority approved the first task order with them back last fall in October. And that work is that initial phase of work is currently underway, and we'll do a little bit of an update. So I do want to kind of focus on a couple of the things in the selection. So ITERIS itself is a very large transportation technology company. They have a lot of depth of experience in technology, in particular transit signal priority implementation projects. So they have, for example, a pretty extensive lab where they can test pretty much every type of controller. They have project managers that have quite a bit of experience with larger implementations than we're working on here. They have quite a depth of different traffic engineering specialists. And then complementing that, we have Parametrics, who is kind of our local project manager in the field. And Mark's on I think Mark might have, hopefully he has his camera on. He's the local project manager here. I've worked with Mark in the past. I think several of the jurisdictions have worked with Mark, but he really is the boots on the ground person that's been out there, and Mark's gone through several deployments within the region for both technology and specifically transit signal priority. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'm going to have Mark jump in, but I just wanted to say one of the things we really appreciated when we were onboarding the current consultant team was their approach to the project. So they're just, their ability to recognize that we need to build off of that past work and move this forward. And also recognizing the significant issue that we're facing with kind of this data collection part, which is really important to not just the original deployment. So we get this initial deployment of smart corridors working with transit signal priority, but the monitoring and maintenance of that is what's going to make it successful, and adding some of those additional smart corridor components that Vina referenced earlier. So that's one of the challenges that we asked them to roadmap. So he'll talk about the current work and how we're working towards that next phase, which we call implementation roadmap. So Mark, if you want to go ahead, and are you ready to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. And thanks. Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Eric, for that nice introduction. Appreciate that. So I'm representing the Iteris team, and we've got an approach to implementing transit signal priority in these smart corridors. And this slide just kind of sums that up. We've kicked off the project. We're working with the local agency partners. We're working with TRPC and others to really map this out. An important part of this is data, understanding these corridors, and we're working through that. We're going to develop a concept of how we want to implement improvements, specifically transit signal priority. And part of that is looking at the technologies related to that. And then finally, we'll work through a demonstration, first a small scale demonstration that kind of is a proof of concept of how this technology will work, married with current investments in the corridor. And then we'll use that and the lessons learned from that to implement the signal priority improvements on a larger scale. And one of the goals of this approach is to develop an approach that allows us to take what we've learned in this process and to have a plan that's scalable. So whether we want to implement that for 5 intersections or 10 intersections or multiple corridors, we can do that. And our plan recognizes that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the activities that are currently taking place, and we have our first task order. And that the goal of that task order, the primary goal is to really develop what's called a roadmap that outlines the steps and the project elements that are necessary for successful deployment in these smart corridors. And there's really 4 key activities that we're working through to accomplish that. The first I mentioned is data collection, and that's really building a really good understanding of these corridors and the way they operate today. We're looking at the technology that's involved, investments that have been made previously. We're looking at the M-TRAC transit signal priority system and how that'll work with that technology. And then we're also looking at data and technology related to data and how we collect data in these corridors. Eric mentioned the importance of working with our jurisdictional partners. And I just want to stress again how important that is, building upon previous investments that our local agency partners have made. And then finally, we're working through testing and field verification to make sure that the equipment that we've selected plays well together, works well together, and achieves the goals that we have in mind. Next slide, please. And so when we look at data, one of the things that we've learned with COVID is that things have changed, and we have to recognize that, and we have to plan for that. We've looked at traffic volumes, and those have changed from pre-COVID conditions. We're looking at transit, how different transit performance metrics have changed, whether that's travel time, ridership, and other parameters that we're working with. We're also looking at the individual intersections, signal timing, the controllers, and as conditions change, whether those are traffic volumes or transit kinds of things, we need to make sure that this system that we're implementing is designed to meet those current conditions and conditions as they change in the corridor. So we're working through that, and that's an important reason for this data collection effort. Next slide. So we're working on a concept of how to implement this technology, this M-Track technology that provides priority for transit. And it's not brand new. It's a technology that's been around for a while, but it has some additional upgrades that are new. And so we're working through those and incorporating that. But we want to make sure that this technology fits the existing conditions and constraints. And that means it needs to work with a local agency cabinets and controllers. Not every agency has the same traffic signal controller, the same equipment, the same type of cabinet. Even the types of communications between agencies is different. So we want to make sure it can fit all those different conditions. And so we're evaluating that. An important part of that development process is testing the different components, whether that's controllers or that's TSP equipment and software, so that we can really make sure that all the pieces play well together and we understand how they'll work together. And as we're looking at that, you know, we're going to be developing different timing strategies. And the reason that that's important is because transit signal priority as well as signal timing is really a balancing act. We're balancing all the different needs and priorities at the different intersections and making them work well together, whether that is, you know, how traffic operates on the side streets. We have emergency vehicles in these corridors. We want to make sure that those are still prioritized. We've got signal coordination. And so we're looking at all those different components in how they work together to do our transit signal priority. Next slide. So one of the important steps that we're taking is, I call it a proof of concept, but it's really a test to kind of work through a structured process to make sure all of the different elements and pieces work well together and we can predict a successful outcome. And we're working with the local jurisdictional partners to do that. And part of what we'll be doing is not only testing the equipment in a lab environment. In this case, it will be the local agency signal shops. We'll have a controller in a cabinet with the M-Track equipment, and we'll be running that equipment through a set of tests to make sure that all those components work well together. And then we'll be looking to take that test out to a field environment, selecting some test intersections, and we'll then run some tests that you can't duplicate in a lab environment. Again, making sure that all of the pieces work well together. We can predict the outcome, and that will inform how we do our transit signal priority design and how we actually do timing and different settings for the system for each of the individual intersections. And when we do these field tests, we'll look at the response both from the equipment as well as looking at traffic and how the equipment responds under different conditions, whether that's congestion or changes in types of events like a emergency vehicle as they come through the intersection. We'll use that information to validate how the system works. And then if we need to, we'll adjust our concept, we'll adjust our strategies to better suit the needs of the equipment as well as the intersections. And that's really an important step that we're working through now with our local agency partners. Next slide. You're probably wondering, you know, what's our schedule look like? And so in blue here is kind of the schedule as it relates to our first task order, looking at the different tasks. And then the orange there also looks at other tasks that are ongoing, including the future corridor implementation, which would be a separate task order that our team would take on. But looking at our first task order, we've been working through our data. We've made requests to our local agency partners and looking at their equipment, making sure we understand what their current firmware is and how that relates to the different equipment they have. We've been working through strategies on how to implement transit signal priority, as well as how to collect data, how to manage these corridors once we've finished deploying new equipment and the local agencies are managing these corridors, after we complete our work. So we're working through that. And then, as I mentioned, we're working through a process to test this equipment, both in a lab environment, as well as some select intersections in the field. And that includes bench testing. And you can see, looking at the schedule, that the bench testing and that testing is happening this month. We hope to have that completed at the end of April. At the end of April, that last week, we have some tests that are scheduled at both the city of Lacey as well as the city of Olympia. And then in May, we're hoping to have an actual field demo to take what we learned in the lab, apply it in the field, and again, confirm that all of that equipment works correctly. And then from that, we'll develop our final roadmap and kind of spell out how the different elements should be deployed, how they'll work together, what that scope looks like, and what that roadmap looks like moving forward. So that's a quick rundown of the schedule and what that looks like. Next slide. Each project is not without its challenges, and we've worked through some challenges on this project. I mentioned data. Conditions have changed with COVID. Traffic volumes, traffic patterns have changed. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that we have to work through, and we have to make sure that when we implement it, it's not for a condition that existed in 2019, but it's for a condition that exists today. And also, it's part of our roadmap. We also want to be able to adjust, and that's why data is important. So if conditions do continue to change, our technology and our concepts and our strategy can change with that and can accommodate that change. And one of the other challenges that we've been working through is also with COVID. There hasn't been the same level of freedom, to work in the field and work together in the shop environment. I think we've been able to do a lot of things virtually, and that's helped. But that's been also a challenge that we've been working through. And I think it's been successful. One of the things that is been improved with technology is our ability to collect data. One of the challenges with traditional data collection is that you collect data that is reflecting maybe one very narrow slice in time. You go out and collect data for maybe 3 days or even a week, but it really reflects that static data of that period of time that reflects a very narrow slice of what may be happening in the corridor. And so we're working through some ideas and some technologies that allow us to look at a more diverse and rich slice of data, looking at how data changes over the year, over months, weekends versus weekdays, so that we can anticipate changes and anticipate how this technology may be needed to adjust to those changes over time. And then finally, we want this system and this technology to be forward-looking, meaning we recognize that technology continues to change. We recognize that we want additional types of technologies in these smart corridors. Transit signal priority is just one service that can live in these smart corridors, and we recognize there may be other technologies. So we want what we do to be compatible with other services, other technologies, to the best that we can. And so we have an eye toward that, and we are working toward that and trying to integrate that into our roadmap and how we build these technologies for the future. So that's a quick summary of the activities where we are. So I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and I'm going to turn it back to Eric for Q&A, but I am available for questions if you have them.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, if there's questions, Bina and Mark and I will be in the bullpen, ready ready to take the grilling.
Brian, I see your hand up. And then Pete.
Yes, I thank you for the briefing. It was very informative. I kept hearing the term technology, technology, and technology. And being somebody who has studied technology, I'm curious on, are we looking at making sure that legacy systems, and what are you looking for lifetime, as in from cradle to grave of this particular project? And I have a follow-up question to ask once those are answered.
That's a packed question, Brian. So I'll give the short version, and if Mark wants to jump in, I would say that one of the goals back when funds were initially awarded for this was to bring that traffic signal technology kind of up to the standard where it was being updated. It was more reflective of kind of the open source controller functionalities that were there, and to kind of level the playing field. And I think the goal from that was each of the jurisdictions would be moving forward with keeping those systems up to date on the traffic signal controller side. On the transit side, it's similar. We've updated our CAT AVL, which is our automated dispatch vehicle location, which also drives kind of the it drives the schedule information for our route. So it's kind of the brains behind the data feeds that our customers lean on. And so those components from the transit signal priority side are definitely more current than they were, and they're forward facing. As far as the life cycle, I think each of the different jurisdictions probably has their own standard for life cycle, but I believe the goal of smart corridors was to level the playing field with the controller technology to make sure that deploying these different strategies could be achieved across the different platforms.
Okay, and I guess my next follow-up question for all of this, which I appreciate the answers there, is when we're talking about for communication, are we looking at going with Wi-Fi, or are we looking at utilizing a traditional radio frequency system?
Great question, and I think the answer is all of the above. So there are currently different components to when we use the term communication. If you think about the bus to signal communication, for example, that uses an RF type of frequency to communicate between the bus, the vehicle location, and the discriminators that we're using for transit signal priority. If you think about data polling, we're looking at both the built-in communication functions of some of the jurisdictions' current systems, as well as supplementing that with cellular. So I think there's a whole range in there, but it would be, I would say, using a wide range of communication options to provide us the ability to kind of bring the whole system in line with data collection to meet those goals. And then that will also help us identify where we need to focus additional funding support. So it might be in the lines of updating our communication along these corridors at a corridor level, maybe, versus a jurisdictional level. So that might be one of the strategies. I won't broadcast what I think funding should be used for. I'm just giving an example. Do you have anything else you want to add, Mark?
Yeah, I can. I mean, communication is important. Thanks for the question. And, we're using existing communications that are in place in the corridor. So we're using the communications that come with the technology. Eric mentioned the 900 megahertz system that the Amtrak system uses. So we're trying to build upon current investments. So we're not necessarily developing a new communication network, but we're trying to build upon what's there. One thing I'll say about the technology, because we did mention technology before, technology is only as good as the data that drives it. And we recognize that. And one of the great, advancements that's being made is how data can be used. And the primary, area there is data analytics. And so we're looking at that because we want to be forward looking, and we recognize that data is going to drive how technology is used. Technology is not going to be the driver, but it's the data that's going to drive the technology. So we want these corridors to be smart in the fact that we're gathering data. Some of that can be used for the technology that we're implementing, but we also want to have a good, rich data set that can be used to plan the next phase of these smart corridors, whether that's additional communications, whether that's additional services. So we're really trying to be smart about how we do that. So we lay that foundation, and we recognize that data is going to be a primary driver of that in the future.
Thank you very much for the answers. I really appreciate that. I apologize for if they sound like loaded questions. It's just I just want some clear understanding of where we were going, what we were doing, because I've worked in those fields and seen that research, and it gets quite entertaining when you all of a sudden develop something, you think you did a good job, and it becomes nothing but a doorstop. So thank you for answering.
Thanks, Brian. Pete, comment?
Thank you, Chair. I just thought I'd provide a little perspective on this and have a request for staff, and that is my understanding of the smart corridors concept came out of some of the transportation planning we did now several years ago, where we identified certain streets or roads where it really wasn't practical to widen them to increase their capacity. For example, Capitol Boulevard in Tumwater and Olympia is an example of that. And so really trying to figure out how to move more people, not necessarily vehicles, but more people along those corridors by whatever means. And so this traffic override, the signal override for transit is certainly one element of that. But I know that we are also looking at how do we provide for, other alternative modes, pedestrian, bicycles. Of course, today we have roundabouts. I don't even think that was part of the discussion back when we started this whole thing. So I'd be curious. I think it would be helpful for a future presentation by TRPC staff to just identify where these corridors are, what steps have been taken so far to try and improve the capacity of these corridors, what's planned in the near future, or is at least in the pipeline, so that and if we have any performance data about how these corridors are performing, I think it would be helpful as well. So I'll just leave it at that. I think this is an important element of it, but I think it's also important that we not get overly focused on this, that there are other pieces to the smart corridor picture, as I recall. Thank you.
Thanks for that,
Yeah.
Pete.
And so I think what you're talking about are the strategy corridors, and they are geographically similar and very linked. And so we'd be happy to bring information back on what strategies we're employing in these corridors to move people, like you said, and smart corridors being one of those strategies, which is in itself a large project. So thank you for bringing that context to the discussion.
So maybe I missed this, but do we know how many of these systems have been deployed within Thurston County? How many interchanges have this technology? And are all the jurisdictions using the exact same technology, the same brand, for ease of purpose? And is it smart enough where we can see traffic moving between jurisdictions?
I'll take the first cut at that. On the technology side, I think that within our region, we have two kind of primary traffic signal controller types that are upgraded to what I would, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like basically the 2070, which is the open architecture, full range of compatibility. There are differences in how they're set up based on location and some of the configurations. So I think from that standpoint, yeah, the region is fairly compatible. I don't think there's any deficiencies. There are some areas where, so downtown Olympia, for example, is a very tight grid network, and they run quite a bit of coordination. And they have some older equipment, but they have the capabilities there to deploy the newer functionalities of those controllers. So I think that's probably more of a geographic consideration for how those different strategies would be used. So, and I think on the communication side, yeah, we have some locations that are kind of wired and ready. And there are some areas that need a lot of support. So I think part of the goal of this first phase of the project would be looking at how we connect that, because getting back to the data question, decision making is really driven by the knowledge of what's happening, where those interactions are occurring, and how we respond to that. That also gets back to Pete's comments about kind of stacking the different kind of backgrounds that we have on these different strategy corridors and the different types of projects that we have going. For us too, I think I've had the question that is, what's the difference between the TSP corridor and our BRT corridor? They're geographically the same, and we're hoping that layering in TSP will support the bus rapid transit type service to be more successful at getting people more quickly, across town and creating a better option for transit use. So,
because you'd think like on our major corridors, the Martin Way corridor, the Pacific Avenue corridor, going down to Olympia, that the system would be smart enough where a light's not turning red in front of you when there's no traffic on either other side. And it seems like that happens quite often. And so I'm figuring that this technology isn't implemented on that most of that corridor, because I've seen that happen very, very often. You're going along and light turns red and you're like, why is this light turning red? There's no one turning on on either other side.
I think if someone were to say, what's your, what would the vision would be if we get another incident where we have an I-5 disruption, it would be that our shops are connected and the staff already have a plan and they're dynamically managing kind of that incident bubble for something like that. But that also could evolve into, let's say, rather than having a seasonal change in traffic settings, it could almost be a weekly or daily based on data feeds that actually support quicker decisions, that everybody knows where those decision points are coming from and they trust the data. So,
yeah. And we're not there yet.
We're
just not there yet.
But that's what we're building towards.
Okay. Is there any other questions? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I was next up is the Human Service Transportation Plan update. I just was chatting with Karen. She's gonna send that out in an email. We're getting a little behind time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for discussion for our last couple items here. So next up is the Federal Infrastructure and Capacity for Grant application. Or let's do the legislative session first, Mark. Let's talk about your work, and then it'll go right into this discussion.
Sure. So wanted to make sure policy board members were aware of the event that we had earlier this week. So the I-5, the work on I-5, and really our whole north-south transportation system has been a top priority of the policy board and council for at least the last 6 years. And we've made a lot of progress on that work. We've had excellent leadership from our local electeds, from our state electeds, and that has resulted in now over $80 million of investment in this I-5 corridor at this point. And so earlier this week, the Nisqually Indian Tribe organized an event that included Governor Inslee, Senator Cantwell, Congresswoman Strickland, and a whole host of our local and regional elected officials. And they took a tour of the Nisqually River. And we've talked a lot here, and you've seen our presentations of the threat to the Nisqually River bridges in terms of the Nisqually River is cutting its channel towards I-5 there at the bridges, and the USGS modeling that was conducted over the past couple of years has shown that at the current rates of erosion of that channel and at the current rates that it's cutting towards I-5, that we would expect it to impact I-5 within the next 17 to 30 years. And that's if things remain the same in terms of we don't have another big flood event like 96, 97 that could make that happen tomorrow in terms of cutting its channel to I-5. And so we had the opportunity to talk about that issue. And also I got to address the group and talk about this from the transportation perspective. And so I shared with them our modeling results from 2045 that show that at I-5 US 101, we'll have roughly a 5 mile backup if nothing is changed in that southbound direction during that afternoon peak period. And that the other pinch point at Mounts Road, we'd expect somewhere between a 5 to 7 mile backup in that southbound direction when the current work to add an HOV lane through Joint Base Lewis McChord is complete in 2025. At that point at Mounts Road, we'll go from 4 lanes, 3 general purpose, 1 HOV, down to the 3 general purpose lanes. And that's where we would expect to see a 5 to 7 mile backup. I talked also about how this is a large project and there's a lot of challenge there with what needs to be done in terms of the Nisqually River Delta, but there's a lot of opportunity in this as well in terms of opportunity to look at adding an HOV lane that extends into the Thurston region. Looking at the resiliency of our transportation system, like adding the 3 roundabouts that we've talked about in this forum, 1 in Yelm, 2 just outside of Yelm in Pierce County that really help with that main alternate route, Highway 507, which is important on an everyday basis, but especially when we have impacts to I-5 like we saw with the train derailment in late 2017, where then Highway 507 became the primary route to make it around that incident. It was either that or you'd go up to Tacoma and around and down Hood Canal and adding 2 to 7 hours to the trip just to get around that. And talked about the opportunity of using this work to connect our trail system up to Pierce County to give another option for folks to reach. For example, when the commuter rail comes to DuPont in 2045, give another opportunity for folks to be able to access the Pierce County and King County. And talked about the high capacity transportation work. And so just a reminder to folks during this last session, as we were talking with legislators about this I-5 issue, with the help of Senator Hunt, we ended up meeting with the Senate Transportation Chair, Senator Leas, and about I-5 and about high capacity transportation. And he was very interested in seeing us kind of amp up our work around what's feasible on what time frame, what kind of cost at a grand scale for different high capacity transportation options, like increasing the current express bus service that Intercity Transit provides to Lakewood, and the opportunity, if that were on an HOV lane, how that could be better functioning, how van pools could better function with that HOV lane, carpools, and how those kinds of investments help with the equity of our transportation system. And so we're going to be looking over the next year to 2 at those options, like increasing the express bus service, the potential for commuter rail. And also, folks may have noticed that the Move Ahead Washington package included $150 million to look into the Cascadia ultra high-speed rail connecting Vancouver, BC to Portland. And obviously that would be coming through our region and also need to cross the Nisqually River. And so the intent was that that TRPC be looking at the feasibility of these different options so that whatever ends up being designed and constructed to address the issues with I-5 can account for what those future options look like in terms of high capacity transportation. So the long and the short of it is this priority of ours has clearly become a state priority as well. Move Ahead Washington, including 75 million for this project, the attention that it is getting from the governor, from our federal delegation, is really marking that now as a state priority, and we're gaining more and more traction as a federal priority as well. And so next steps for this is we're going to be looking for our original request from the state for this next phase, which was right now we have the funding to do the National Environmental Policy Act review. And I want to highlight that for folks because that can sound like a wonky process part, but for the interests of folks in our region, that is an incredibly important opportunity for us to make sure that all the things that we believe need to be considered as they're talking about I-5, as they're designing what kinds of fixes, that the interests of our constituencies are represented in that. And so I want to highlight that WashDOT has just selected Parametrics as the firm to do the National Environmental Policy Act review. They're working on the contract right now. And I met with folks at WashDOT yesterday, Steve Rourke and Joanne Schuler, and they both said that they expect that the scoping process, which is a formal part of the National Environmental Policy Act review, and that is the part where they will ask everyone to tell us what's important about this project so that it gets considered in the NEPA review. That document and that request for information from all of us will come out before the end of this year. And so we'll keep people informed, but I just want to kind of put a pin in that because that'll be a very important time for our area to tell the state, here's the kinds of things that absolutely need to be considered in this review. And the last thing that I'll mention is with that 75 million, our understanding of the legislative intent for that was that 19 million would go to to constructing the 3 roundabouts, one in Yelm, 2 outside of Yelm. And then the rest would go towards that design work. After NEPA is done, we'll have the preferred alternative. And then that 75 million or 75 million minus 19 can be used to start to design that preferred alternative. The language in Move Ahead Washington didn't talk about the roundabouts. And so when we met with WashDOT earlier, there was some question as to whether that was going to get done or not. Over this past week through that event, we've been meeting with Representative Andrew Barkus, and he had several conversations with WashDOT. And we think we've got a plan to clarify that legislative intent so that those roundabouts can be built with this 75 million. That's really important for helping the function of 507 today, but especially important when and if we start doing any sort of construction work on I-5, more people will be using that alternate route. And so what we can do to improve it ahead of time will help us. So there is a lot going on around this project at this point. This has gone from our priority to a state priority and increasingly a national priority. So we're getting great momentum on this.
Karen, do you have anything you want to add real quick to this?
No.
Okay, well then let's jump right into this next item. So I think the policy board knows that I've been pretty active in the National League of Cities, which is the association that represents cities and towns, the federal government, they're also pretty instrumental in helping to get past the Bill Act, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. And as it's already been pointed out in this meeting, we're talking about once in a lifetime dollars. We have not seen an investment in our transportation system this big since prior to the highway system being built. And as I've been a part of this process and hearing more about it as it's come out, City of Lacey does have a federal lobbyist as well that has gone through the bill and looked at all the different funding options. And also hearing from Secretary Buttigieg when I was back in DC, it's become very clear to me that there's going to be winners and losers in this transportation package. And the winners are going to be the ones that can have the resources to match up projects with available funding. And it became pretty clear as well that what the federal government is looking for right now is big projects, the transformational projects. I kept on hearing this word transformational. And the way we have always approached grants, within Thurston County has been on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. It's because we've had to work within the confines of our transportation funding. But now with a funding package this big and this transformational, I started thinking, we really need to put some more resources into someone, a staff members, to really look at all the major projects that we have and be able to match up those fundings with the projects from a regional basis. Because I think what I'm seeing is it's really large projects that have a lot of regional support, community support with a process in place that are the ones that are gonna be picked. And we just talked about this earlier. It's like we've gone from barely getting $500,000 grants to now you have to think bigger and more steps along the way. And now it's $1 million grant where it's not even gonna be considered. And so the question and some conversations I've been having with the leadership of the Transportation Policy Board and with Mark is there an opportunity for the Thurston TRPC to have a role here, to have some resources that can look to match up what we all have in our individual communities, but bring these together into bigger packages. And so instead of, for example, Lacey just doing a grant for our College Street corridor, we look at combining that grant, that College Street corridor grant, with Tumwater's East Street grant, for example, or project, and we apply for it under one major grant that's going to have a major regional significance. And I think that is how we're going to be winners in out of this transportation package, is that we are working together, we're thinking bigger, we're looking at really ways that we can take advantage of this package where the dollars in it is just something like we've never seen before. So I've had this conversation with Mark and with the leadership team. And I just want to throw it back out to the policy board and see what you guys are thinking. Does it make sense to see if we can put some more resources in now, where we've had some conversations saying, hey, maybe what we need to do is look a couple years down. Let's the projects that we've all applied for, let's go for that. But let's look at maybe some out years on putting some resources so we can take advantage of it. But for example, South County, I think the way we South County wins out of this is what we look at the whole South County corridor and apply for a major transformational change, improvements on 507, and not just look at city by city, but let's look at the whole corridor and what would that look like. Brian, I see your hand up.
Yes, I understand what you're saying, and that's what I was going to ask. Is I understand that I-5 corridor, Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, very important. But if you're looking at trying to add to get another 500,000 involved with the study, trying to get resources, we need to look at 507.
Yep.
Expanding 507, building loops, which means purchasing movement corridors before that we want to see if you're direction.
Okay, I lost you there a little bit, your audio there, at least on my end, but I agree. I agree with what you're saying. This would be a different way of us, looking at transportation funding. Like I said, we've always done this sort of on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, but I really think we can still do those projects, but let's combine those projects and go out for a bigger ask. Vice Chair?
Yeah, I just, Mark, I believe you talked with the TAC about this idea, and I'm just curious if you can share, what you heard from the Technical Advisory Committee around this concept.
The response was primarily that the TAC members know how to apply for the funds through the existing programs. Those existing programs will be getting more funds. And so there was a question of whether there was a need for sort of a regional approach from TAC members.
And I'm telling you what, I wasn't surprised about that answer, actually, for that reaction. I had some conversations even with Lacey staff, and they're like, it's like, we're receiving more money. We just apply for the regular grants like we always have. Where there's more money, we should get it. And to tell you the truth, I think that's sort of the old way of looking at transportation funding compared to what this new package is offering, which is, yeah, there are existing funds, that is more, but there are something like 30 new categories of funding that we haven't even gone through and looked at to see where the correlation is to our region. And so, and there's nothing to say that we can't put our existing projects in there and ask for it together as a regional ask. I think it would have a better chance of getting funding that way, actually, than if we're just doing jurisdiction by jurisdiction. But Pete, comment?
Yeah, I guess my question, Andy, is are you thinking that we would then allocate a portion of the federal transportation dollars to hire a person at TRPC that their sole job would be to help find these funds and help jurisdictions put together packages?
That's exactly what I'm proposing. Yes.
Okay. I have to, from what I recall, and Mary Heather or Peter or Gabi could correct me, but I mean, the big challenge in Tumwater is frankly staff limitations. You just, and TRPC staff have helped us in the past with grant applications. And so, I mean, I think you're right. These are big dollars. There are some unique categories here that haven't appeared before that I think are consistent with what we're trying to do, and is trying to figure out what group of projects, like you say, will compete. And so if it takes additional coordination at the regional level, I think it would make sense to do that. It's not that expensive to do it. I think the question is, can you find anybody in a timely manner,
Well, and that's what we've been talking about. What would be really nice is to find someone, in the transportation staffer from, one of our senators or even one of our representatives, someone who's been part of this process and understands this bill for sure. And so, but we don't know unless we go out there and solicit. And I think this would help everyone. Now, you know, Lacey, I think I have my chair of the Transportation Policy Board hat on right now. I think Lacey has a lot of great staff, and I think they probably feel pretty comfortable being able to go out and go after these grants. But I think the regional part of this is going to be so important on actually getting some of these grants, because they're not looking. Our vision has been so sort of narrow, and we've been, you know, we understood that it's been so competitive in the past, and we're lucky to get what we have. This is a different scenario. This is a once in a lifetime dollars, and we should be putting resources to try and secure as much of those funding as we can as a region. That's what makes sense to me. Don, and then I'll go to John.
Well, I think you're talking about changing old habits for a darn good reason. I mean, all the agencies have been largely used to working through the federal with some TRPC assistance. But if what you say is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, a more collaborative approach, and if that involves adding staff at TRPC, I think we should be for it. And I think also, like I said, it's going to involve staff in each of the political entities looking at a broader perspective as opposed to the way they've always done it. And so I would support it.
Yeah, you know, the whole goal here would be to look at each of our jurisdictions has a tip, right? And so to be able to look at that tip and see where the regional crossing is, and not only for maybe some of these small grants for South County, where, you know, some of these other things, but we need someone, a dedicated resource to do this. And if it's not TRPC, then I don't know who it could be. So like I said, I think this makes a lot of sense. John, and then I'll go to Brian. Oh, you're on mute.
Downtown Olympia at the Evergreen Plaza building on the 4th floor is the Federal Highway Transportation Division. You might want to talk to the department head over there. They might be able to help you find somebody.
Appreciate that. Brian?
Yes, I like your idea. I think one of the best things that we could do, and this is just looking at lessons learned from King County and various other places, we need to start looking at movement corridors as a county, as a region, and look at everything that can go for those movement corridors. Because right now, land is about to go up in price as time goes on. And so that's if you are watching what's going on with Sound Transit, the most expensive portion of their light rail system is land.
Yep.
And so we should be looking at the big picture of, as a region of, let's start looking at purchasing the land for the movement corridors, start looking at size, looking at these things, because I can tell you, just speaking from representing Yelm, we have the 510 bypass, which is going to help us out, but then there's a huge choke point when you get to McKenna. But we also have the 507 that we don't even have a bypass for that yet, nor do we have land or actual corridor for that. Just imagine Tumwater, Tenino, when it starts to grow, 507 goes right through their downtown.
Yeah.
So, you know, these are things that we need to start looking at as a region. And so I like your idea. I just want to say, let's look at it and not only look at current things, but also the future of saying, these are the movement corridors. We purchased the land. What is the process of preparing for it, even before we lay asphalt down?
Yep.
So thank you.
Thank you, Danny. And I know we're over on time.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick, like, next step kind of a question. So maybe that's a good pivot.
Thank you.
You know, one of the big unknowns for our staff in Olympia is that there are a lot of unknowns around, how this funding is coming through, what programs. And one of our biggest limitations for our jurisdiction is having shovel-ready projects to be able to go out for funding. But my question is around, in terms of next steps, is do we have a better sense of a timeline of when we would need to make a decision by?
So
timeline.
my request is for Mark and TRPC staff put together a proposal and maybe be a two-part proposal. What does the proposal look like right now if we need a little extra funding to do this? Or what we've also talked about, can we use existing planning dollars to add this staff where it doesn't necessarily cost us anymore? We're just using federal funding to hire this person. Those are two different avenues, right? One's like immediate, and other ones is it will have to be a part of our next transportation funding package that comes up to set aside money for a person, which be a little bit longer. So if you could put together those two scenarios and bring it back to us so we can analyze it a little bit more, I really appreciate that. Okay, thank you everyone. I'm really excited about this. I think I really do think we can have a huge impact and take advantage of this this package if we're all in it and working together. So you have a quick outside meeting report, Vice Chair?
Oh, we can skip it, it's fine.
Okay, well then with that, we've reached the end of our agenda. Thank you everyone. Without objection, I'll call this meeting adjourned.
Good idea. Thank you.